Thank you, Eric. So folks, how you doing? Thank you very much, Eric. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and also Eric endorsed me during my primary. I had a very competitive primary, and so I very much appreciate that as well. Maybe just a little bit of background on myself. I come from a business background. I was the former chief operating officer of the online brokerage firm that is now called TD Ameritrade. And I ran for Senate in 2006. And at that time, actually, that's when I first came out against earmarks. Lost that race pretty handily to Ben Nelson, the famous Cornhusker kickback guy. You ever heard of him? But I stayed involved. I really became like you all. I helped start a free market think tank, a watchdog group, got involved with the grassroots. And it's important because politics is run by the people who show up. And that's why I want to thank all of you here today for showing up, for being a part of how we turn this country around, for helping to educate your fellow citizens on why we need conservative policies to keep this a great country. Because if we don't, we will end up, as Governor Jindal was saying, in that European nightmare. So thank you very much for what you all do. And clap for yourselves, that's good. So I was hired by the people of Nebraska last November. And the reason they hired me was to take my business skills and bring them to government to make it work for the people of Nebraska. And I got to say, I'm encouraged as I look around the country because we see other business leaders who are now stepping up to try to do the same thing, or people who actually preceded me, really. Think about Rick Scott in Florida, Bill Haslam in Tennessee, Rick Snyder in Michigan, Doug Ducey just got elected the same time I did for Arizona. So we're seeing business leaders get elected, and it's important because the salvation of this country will not come from Washington, D.C. The salvation of this country will come from the states. That's where the innovation comes from. So what I've been working on in Nebraska is what all governors ought to be working on, which is how do you grow the state? How do you create more and better paying jobs? How do you create even brighter futures for our people? And to do that, I've been focused on three broad categories. So I thought I'd talk about those here today, and then we'll, if we have time left over, which I'm sure we will, we'll have some questions and answers. So what we're focusing on in Nebraska is starting with becoming more competitive when it comes to taxes. Again, if we can return more of the money back to the people, that gives them the opportunity to be able to invest it and create those jobs. And the way we get sustainable tax relief is by cutting government, cutting that growth, slowing it down, allowing our revenues to continue to grow so that we can give more money back to the people. In my first budget, so I took over in November and had to get a budget ready in about 2 months, we cut the growth of government nearly in half. And because we were able to do that, we were able to take up one of our tax relief programs by 45%. And so in this biennium right now that we're in Nebraska, we will deliver over $400 million in tax relief back to the citizens of Nebraska. Now, to do that, what I'm doing is bringing the best practices that I learned in the private sector to state government. And what I found is a lot of those practices are not in place. Simple things, like job descriptions. We don't have them. Annual reviews to know if we're holding people accountable. And measurements to even know if our agencies are doing what they're supposed to be doing. If we don't have measurements to hold the bureaucracy accountable, how can we make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? So we're putting those things in place. In fact, one of the things I've done, which is not a particular innovation for the private sector, but it is new for government, we're one of the first states to have it, is having a chief operating officer. A position where that man is responsible for putting those measurements in place for all of our agencies so we can hold them accountable. and then for focusing on process improvement to drive down the cost of state government. And we're focusing on a variety of issues to try and do a better job for the people of Nebraska. For example, we're taking on entitlement reform. We're turning our unemployment system into a reemployment system. We're requiring that everybody who wants to apply for unemployment benefits has to sit down with a job coach, fill out a resume. And this is important because that resume is going to be electronic. So not only will it help that person apply for jobs, it'll be proactive so that companies can search it for the skills they need and reach out. And this is one of the ways that we can stop trapping people in that entitlement system. Help them get off of public assistance as quickly as possible and back into the job force. It's better for them, and it's better for the taxpayer. And that's a first-in-the-nation program where we're proactively allowing companies to search that database to find those people. And of course, then we can track all of this to see who's applying for jobs and make sure the system is working. Another thing we're doing is helping our agencies communicate better. For instance, one of the things we found when I stepped into the office is that our prison inmates were collecting unemployment insurance. They were getting the benefits. You're not supposed to do that. But because our Department of Corrections and our Department of Labor started communicating better, we discovered this and put a system in place to stop that. So those are some of the things we're doing at the state government level to make sure we can run it better, make it work better for the people in Nebraska, applying some of those business practices to do a better job. Now, another area that we have to focus on is cutting red tape. At the state, we're going to do a better job. Again, remember that measurement thing. So for instance, in our Department of Environmental Quality, we're going to start measuring now how long it takes to issue a permit. Seems kind of basic, but we weren't doing it. And just by measuring it now, guess what? The time to issue permits has started to come down. People pay attention when you know what they're focused on. And so we're going to say, make commitments that we're going to issue a permit, say, in 90 days. So the business can plan around that, take the uncertainty out of that process. And that'll help that business be able to do a better job of creating jobs for the people in Nebraska. Now, one of the other important functions of the states is to defend its state sovereignty and push back on the federal government. And we're doing that in Nebraska. I'll give you a few examples of just how crazy some of the things, for instance, the EPA is doing. When I was on the campaign trail, I ran across a plant in Nebraska. The EPA required them to buy a sweeper to sweep up their parking lot and driveway, keep the dust down. It cost them $100,000. That plant was in the middle of a cornfield. What do you think happened when the wind blew? It's just an example of that mentality of the EPA, which is a one-size-fits-all answer. And if it just stopped there, it would be one thing. But what we're seeing right now from Obama's administration is a huge expansion of the EPA. They are doing a huge power grab on multiple fronts. I'll talk about a couple of them. One, Waters of the U.S. This is a case where the EPA is trying to take the Clean Water Act to expand their power. Now, the Clean Water Act of 1972 was intended to give the EPA regulatory authority over navigable waters. In fact, Congress's intent could not have been more clear. They said navigable water something like 81 times in that legislation. Now the EPA is saying that navigable waters include ditches, ponds, water standing on a field or a construction site. Now, I'm no Bear Grylls, but I know you cannot take a canoe from a ditch and go anywhere. That's not the definition of navigable. And so we in Nebraska are joining with 27 other states to sue the EPA to get a judge to tell them, no, the EPA is not above the law. If the EPA is allowed to go forward with waters of the U.S., it'll have a devastating impact on the people of my state. It will drive up costs tremendously. One of the bad things in that bill is that it allows a third-party, say, environmentalist group, to sue anybody to get a permit. Just think of the chaos that will unleash when you maybe have a rain and there's some water standing on your construction site and somebody comes up and sues you and says you need a permit. That's what we've got to stop. Thank you. And it gets worse. This week we found out about President Obama's Clean Air Plan. In that original proposal, the EPA was going to make Nebraska cut our carbon emissions 26% by 2032. In the new proposal, they've made it 40%. And given that we have over 60% of our power is generated from coal-burning plants, it makes it virtually impossible for us to comply. Other crazy things in that legislation is that we're given a seven-year window to do that. It takes 8 years to plan new transmission lines. It takes 10 years to plan new power generation. The EPA has set up a no-win situation, which they know we cannot comply with. Can't hear? Back here. Oh, okay. I'll talk a little louder. So what the EPA has set up is a no-win situation for our state. And you may ask why. Good question. What they offered to us when we said, hey, we can't comply with this, this is impossible. They said, well, you can join a regional group. Well, what that is code word for is cap and trade. President Obama could not get cap and trade passed when he had both houses of our Congress because the American people did not want it. And now his EPA is trying to backdoor cap and trade through this new clean power plan, and it's just wrong. So we are going to join with 11 other states and sue the EPA, again, to follow the law. They do not have the authority to do this, and we're going to be a part of the group that stops them. I also sent President Obama a letter saying he needed to approve the Keystone Pipeline. It is absolutely vital that we become energy independent here in North America. Think of what that'll mean for our foreign policy. This Keystone Pipeline will create thousands of jobs in Nebraska, be great for our tax base, and help us become less reliant on foreign oil so that we don't have to buy it from people who hate us. And so I called upon him to go ahead and approve it. Now, I haven't heard back yet. But these are the kind of things that we're going to do to push back from the state of Nebraska on this federal government that is just absolutely out of control. Now, another thing that we can do, in fact, one of the best things we do in government is provide that education to the child so they can reach their potential. And so I'm working on improving education in my state. As I travel around, every manufacturer I talk to tells me they cannot find enough skilled labor. And it's a barrier for them expanding. And so I'm putting together a program working with the private sector to bring those career and vocational training programs back into our schools. You know, when I was in junior high, everybody was required to take career and vocational training. We all took woodworking, metalworking, electronics. But my school district doesn't require that anymore, and I think that's a huge disservice to our kids, not to expose them to the great opportunities we have. Nebraska is also one of 8 states that does not have a charter school law. And so I'm going to work with parents to be able to make sure they've got a choice for their kids' education and bring about that change so we can offer that school choice in the state of Nebraska. Additionally, Nebraska is one of the few states that did not adopt the Common Core. And I'm very proud of our State Board of Education for making that decision, and as governor, I will continue to work with our state board to make sure we do not adopt the Common Core. This is another example of the federal government trying to reach into our lives and tell us how to educate our children. We don't need that help in Nebraska, and we're going to continue to keep them out of our state. So again, thank you all very much for what you do. Folks like me in elected office need your support. We have a lot of work to do to push back against this overreaching federal government. President Obama has not been able to accomplish his agenda through legislation, so he's trying to do it through executive fiat and regulation. And that's where the states are so vital in defending our state sovereignty and pushing back against this overreaching administration. But we can't do it alone. We need the help of folks like you to help educate your fellow citizens, to rally the troops, to be able to push back against this administration. So thank you all very much again for what you do. God bless you, and God bless the great country we live in. Thank you. And with that, I think we've got time for some questions and answers.
That's right. Mo, do we have the question?